مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يقول الإنجيل: كيف سقط الجبابرة. ينطبق الأمر نفسه على الحياة السياسية الأمريكية. هيلاري كلينتون وزيرة الخارجية السابقة، والسناتورة السابقة، والسيدة الأولى السابقة، وحاليا الأوفر حظا للنيل ترشيح للحزب الديمقراطي للرئاسة، لم تسقط، ولكن جرحتها دون شك عن كونها قد احتفظت بنظام اتصالات سري غير رسمي في منزلها خلال فترة عملها في وزارة الخارجية. هل ستدور هذه الفضيحة بفروسها في أن تتولي الرئاسة، أم أنها ستختفي حين تسيطر الكسة الإخبارية التالية على عناوين الأنباء؟ لمناقشة الفضيحة السياسية الحالية في واشنطن والأيام الأولى لحملتنا الرئاسية، يسرني أن أرحب في برنامج داخل واشنطن باللجنة المكونة من الخبيرين السياسيين نورمان أورنستين وديفيد دراكر. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with our panel of political experts, Norm Ornstein and David Drucker. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me this morning.
Absolutely, Rob.
Good to be here.
So today we're going to start with the scandal of the day, or at least the mini scandal, and that's Hillary Clinton and her email account. What is this all about, Norm?
What Hillary Clinton did during her time as Secretary of State was to maintain a private email account with her own server that was in the home that she shares with former President Clinton in Chappaqua, New York. Now, most people who are in high levels of government have a government email account that ends with .gov. Not everybody, including many former secretaries of state, but almost all have separated out official emails from personal emails. She had them all, had them under her control, and this is now just emerging sometime after she's left, but there are real questions about why she did this, what's happened to the emails. She has deleted thousands of what her team said were personal emails, but nobody's had a chance to vet those. And now with a committee investigating Benghazi and many other outlets out there looking at what happened and why, it's become a big story.
So there's no way of really knowing what was ever on this server now that so many have been deleted. Is that right?
That's correct. And essentially, Hillary Clinton's message to the public has been, trust me. I looked through all of the emails. I didn't want to publicize anything that had to do with the planning of my daughter's wedding or communication with my husband, but anything that had to do with government material, public material, that would be subject to a Public Records Act request or would be subject to a congressional investigation. I made sure all of those were preserved and they're going to be available. Hillary Clinton also took pains to explain, according to her, that the email server and her device was always secure. Now, she stated that without explaining why we know it was secure, and she stated it as fact when a lot of experts have said sometimes you don't know if you've been hacked. But she said that the Secret Service that set up her husband, the former president's email server for his post-presidency are the ones that took care of this. And I think the question that lingers here is that she said, well, there are many questions that linger here, but she said, I never sent classified material on my mobile device. But she didn't say anything about whether she received classified material. And I think the big issue for Hillary Clinton is not so much one of transparency, because all politicians are a little bit nefarious about what they want the public to know and don't. And I think voters tend to sort of look at them and go, okay, well, none of you are perfect or you wouldn't be politicians anyway. But one of her biggest selling points for becoming the next president is her competency and the fact that she is up to being a leader and up to being commander-in-chief. And if she's messing around with national security vis-a-vis her email and server while she's Secretary of State, a very senior, important position in our government, then it allows Republicans a way to undercut a core selling point for a Clinton presidency, and that's a problem for her.
Do you think that that this and other stories about the Clinton Foundation and other tarnishing, put it that way, not stabbing in the back, she's not flat out, but a little tarnishing, is this going to bring out of the backdrop other candidates to compete with her for the nomination?
So right now I simply don't see it, and part of the reason I don't see it is it doesn't appear that in this election cycle the Democratic Party has much of a presidential bench. It's much like we saw with Republicans in 2012 after Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels, then Indiana Governor Daniels, decided not to run. Really, other than Mitt Romney, there really wasn't anybody of heft that was in the mix, and Rick Perry faded very quickly. So when you look at the Democratic bench, other than a first term, less than a couple of years senator in Elizabeth Warren, who does excite the liberal base, you don't have a bunch of real heavyweights that could threaten her. Joe Biden has, despite being twice elected vice president of the United States, doesn't appear to have a political base from which to challenge Hillary Clinton. So that's why, number one, I don't see this as a problem for her in terms of winning the nomination without much trouble. But it's also another reason why I think Democrats are circling the wagons here. There is a lot of annoyance among Democrats that they're having to deal with this and deal with it so early, but they've got nobody else. They don't have anybody else to turn to, and therefore they have to stick with Hillary Clinton.
One reason why this is going to be an annoyance is you have a press corps that desperately wants a major race. The big deal, the World Series, the sort of championship, the World Cup of American government and politics is the presidential election campaign. What we're facing is a Democratic nomination that is unprecedented in the parties, where it's open, there's not an incumbent running, and there's no real contest. If there's no contest, reporters that wait every 4 years for this chance lose it. So the focus on this issue is in part a desperation on the part of the political media to try and generate a contest. We're seeing story after story saying, where are these other candidates, trying to dredge up some of those candidates. But that's a burden for her too, because it means that the press focus on this will continue because there's a self-interest in trying to get a race.
How does she change the story? If you're Hillary Clinton and you want to have a different story appear on the front page of the newspaper, what do you have to do to make it happen?
First of all, you have to answer more questions. I don't think Hillary Clinton addressed all of the questions, and I think that it might actually behoove her to hold a news conference similar to what we saw from New Jersey Governor Chris Christie after the scandal over the closure of the George Washington Bridge emerged. He basically exhausted reporters for, I think, about an hour and a half, and they had nothing left to ask. But I do think beyond being a little bit more, because that's how you exhaust reporters in the United States. You just keep asking, you let us ask and ask and ask, and finally we're out of things to ask you, and you get exhausted, and we get exhausted, and we go away. But I think the other thing that would really help Hillary Clinton is to be able to answer more fully some of the questions about the security of her email server, and she is going to have to explain some of the latest revelations that we've become aware of, which is there are forms that members of the State Department, that employees of the State Department, from the Secretary on down, are supposed to sign on their way in and on their way out, and we don't yet know if she fully complied with all of the rules as she says she has.
I don't think she's going to be able to answer all the questions, in part because you can't prove a negative. There are emails that have been erased. How are you going to demonstrate that they were all appropriate ones to erase? I think what may happen here, though, is we now have a slew of congressional committees controlled by Republicans chomping at the bit to use this issue, including this special Benghazi committee. And there's a real chance that the committee will overreach, as has happened in the past with committees. When Darrell Issa was chair of the Government Reform Committee, he went too far and it backfired. And that may happen with this committee led by Trey Gowdy, where it becomes a distraction for this issue. But the other thing that can happen is the news cycle now, the 24-hour news cycle with stories that emerge, means it's very difficult to sustain any one story. Something else comes along and reporters' attention shifts. So there'll be other stories along the way. Now, there may be other stories that aren't particularly better for her, but I think a lot of Democrats believe that 3-6 months from now, this is not going to be at the top of the news, and other things will have emerged.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we'll talk with our panelists about the president, Barack Obama, and his wonderful relationship with the Republicans in Congress in just a minute. Again, my panelists include David Drucker. David is the senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. He has previously reported for CQ Roll Call and the Los Angeles Daily News. Seated on his right is Norman Ornstein. Norm is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, an election analyst for CBS News, and a contributor to the National Journal and Atlantic magazines. His newest book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. So, gentlemen, thinking about the collision of politics, Republicans have sort of let the Hillary Clinton thing run on its own while they've been taking on President Obama in the court of foreign policy. 47 Republicans actually writing a letter to the leader of Iran, not a usual target for the correspondence of Republican senators. What is going on here?
Well, Republicans oppose the president's deal as they understand it. They're particularly concerned about a 10-year sunset after which Iran would be able to pursue nuclear weapons unfettered. And the reason they decided to write the letter, and the reason so many of them signed the letter, is because they feel as though the president is completely leaving them out of the loop, and they're very concerned that he doesn't intend to run any deal by Congress. Now, presidents don't always run diplomatic agreements by Congress and seek ratification, but it's the opinion of the Republicans in Congress that this agreement would be of such a magnitude that it should receive the approval of Congress or the rejection of Congress. And our system does give the Senate and sometimes the full Congress the authority to weigh in on these things. And I think that in my reporting and discussions with Republicans, when I asked them, why did you take this unusual step, and it has received a lot of criticism in some circles, of writing an open letter to the leaders of Iran rather than writing a private letter to the President of the United States, informing him of their position and their concern. And essentially what they told me is they've had about as many private conversations with the President and his advisors as they have been able to, and nobody's listening. And they decided it was time to get his attention.
Norm, what do you think?
This was a colossal blunder, and it was really done by a senator who's been there for 2 months, who served in the House for 2 terms, Tom Cotton. And as John McCain, somewhat chagrined, said afterwards when the blowback was enormous, well, I didn't really look that carefully at the letter. A lot of us were ready to get out of town because the snow was coming, so you got a letter and we signed it. And they also signed it because Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, had signed on to it. But writing a letter to foreign leaders while the president is in the midst of negotiations, before there has been any deal, really is an unprecedented action. It's of a far different standard than individual members of Congress going over to visit with leaders, but not interfering with negotiations. So this was a rookie blunder, but what made it astonishing was that it wasn't the rookies, the junior ones who signed on, it was all the leaders. And now they're suffering significantly in terms of a blowback. And it's also fairly clear that what they've done is to give additional traction to the hardliners in Iran, as we've seen from the response by the Ayatollah Khomeini.
I have to say, if a Martian were looking down at the relationship between Congress and the president over the last couple of months, he'd be wondering where the adults are. I mean, on the one hand, there is this episode, but on the other hand, the White House response to the letter was, we will never, ever go to Congress and talk to them about this deal. Joe Biden's official statement was, there will not be any congressional role in this. That's not the spirit of our system either.
I think a lot of what has happened over the past 6 years is that neither the Republicans in Congress nor the President of the United States and his team have taken each other seriously. and treated each other with any sort of respect for where they fit into our constitutional system of government. I might lay a little bit more responsibility on the part of the president simply because I don't think he has understood or cared to deal with the human nature aspect of members of Congress who are simply not going to be in the same position he is, which is he only has to answer to himself, and he's the only one that can really negotiate agreements among everybody in government. But the Republicans also have a huge responsibility here because they never have really given the president the sort of deference that the presidency normally receives, that they in fact defended when the Republicans controlled the White House. So I think it's just basically come down to a very dysfunctional relationship that I would sort of liken to a relationship between a husband and wife that has gotten so bad that even when they try and fix it by talking to each other, they only make it worse because they can no longer communicate.
You know, it's not just somebody looking down from Mars. The real damage of this letter and what it suggests comes with everybody else around the world who look at the United States now and wonder what's going on and who speaks for the country. And if you talk to, as you have and I have too, representatives from our major allies, they're really stunned by all of this, and it doesn't help much. And of course, what also is the case is if you look at the letter, which was a quite condescending one that Tom Cotton wrote, saying to the Iranians, you should understand our constitutional system. And then you look at the response written by the Iranian negotiator, which pointed out that Cotton didn't understand the constitutional system and what's binding in international law, or what kind of an agreement was being worked out, which was not a bilateral one, but a multilateral one. It's pretty embarrassing.
And when all is said and done, this dysfunction that you're describing and that you're describing, is this going to be with us at least through the balance of the Obama versus GOP administration?
And beyond. You know, what's happened in our politics is that we have moved from normal, robust partisanship, and even a lot of tension that flows from that, which is a natural function of a democracy, to a kind of tribalism. And a level of distrust now between the parties at almost all levels that's toxic. Just to pick another example, the Senate has been considering a bill that has overwhelming, probably unanimous support in the end to deal with human trafficking, a major problem out there. The bill was brought to the floor with a provision in it that on abortion that Democrats didn't know was there. Now, they should have read the bill to see that it was there, but when they asked the Republicans bringing it to the floor what was in the bill, they weren't told about this provision. So you have the two parties basically looking at each other and the leaders looking at each other saying, we can't trust you on even basic things anymore. That spills over into foreign policy in a way that's really unusual, and it's not going away anytime soon.
So, David, all this is going on while one of the key critiques of the president, our nation's economy, seems to be doing better. Unemployment is down to certainly reasonable numbers. What does this do to the Republican argument as we begin to rev up for 2016?
Well, it may make it a little bit harder to go after the Democratic presidential nominee for the president's weak economic performance over much of his presidency, because if people are happy with the recovery as it stands over the next 2 years, then it's easier for the Democrats in that respect. But I think what we've seen at the beginning of this sort of shadow race for the 2016 Republican nomination and the general election is a really high concern over foreign policy, whether it's the rise of the Islamic State, whether it's an expansionist Russia incursions into Ukraine, whether it's Iran and its intent in terms of obtaining nuclear weapons, belligerent China. And number one, I can tell you from talking to political activists as well as very big Republican donors looking at the Republican race, they're more concerned about foreign policy right now than they have been in a long time. And we could be setting up for a foreign policy election. And the reason that is important is because it appears as though the president, Barack Obama, has traded bad ratings on the economy for bad ratings on foreign policy. They've sort of flipped, where for a long time early in his presidency he had good foreign policy ratings and tough economic ratings. It's now flipped. Nobody trusts his foreign policy. They're skeptical of his negotiations with Iran. And that means the Republicans have plenty to chew on. And it's one of the reasons why I don't think at the end of the day they're going to get much blowback from actual real voters over this Tom Cotton letter. Because if you don't like the president's foreign policy, and if you don't think his Iran deal is going to do any good, you're not really going to get that exercised about a party that goes out of its way to try and either oppose the deal or make it stronger, and that's how they've described the purpose of the letter.
Interesting. Just a few seconds, Norm. Could this
Yeah.
be a foreign policy election?
It could, depending on events. But if the public's happy about the state of the economy, and with low gas prices, meaning money in the pockets of working people, if I were just looking at it from a nakedly political standpoint, I'd rather have people happy about the economy and unhappy about foreign policy than the other way around.
Okay, gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much. Excellent discussion. Look forward to having more discussions as we have the run-up to this interminable 2016 election campaign. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول ماضي هيلاري كلينتون ومستقبلها، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.